At 16, I stood outside my own house in the rain, pregnant, shaking, holding a suitcase I had packed in less than 5 minutes, while behind me, without even raising his voice, my father reached for the switch and turned off the porch light as if my existence in that family could be erased that easily. The truth is, that moment did not begin that night. It had been building quietly for years, because a family secret never starts with one decision. It starts with a pattern of silence, with small moments when people choose comfort over honesty, image over love, and control over compassion. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 36 years old now, and if you had met me 20 years ago, standing on that porch in the cold, you would have seen a girl who believed losing her family meant losing everything. What I didn't understand then was that sometimes losing the wrong people is the first step toward finding your real life. I was born in Willow Creek, into a family that looked perfect from the outside. My father, Victor Carter, was a respected corporate lawyer. My mother, Elaine Carter, was known for her elegance, her charity work, and the kind of polished grace that made strangers assume she must be kind. Every Sunday, we sat in the front pew at church in carefully chosen outfits, smiling at the right moments, speaking in the right tone, behaving like the kind of family people quietly envied. To everyone else, we were admirable. But what people do not understand is that the families that look the most perfect on the outside often have the strictest, coldest rules on the inside. My older brother Daniel was everything my father admired. Brilliant, controlled, predictable, the kind of son who made a man like Victor feel secure about legacy. My sister Hannah was socially graceful, beautiful in the way people praise easily, and she always seemed to know when to speak, when to smile, and when to disappear into silence. I was not rebellious, not dramatic, not difficult in any obvious way. I was simply never loved in the same way. That kind of thing is hard to explain to people who did not grow up inside it. It is not always what someone says to you. Sometimes it is what they never say. It is where your photo gets placed, how long they listen when you speak, how quickly your achievements are brushed aside, how often you are made to feel like you should be grateful for the smallest scraps of attention. I learned very early how to make myself smaller, how not to interrupt, how not to need too much, because in that house love was never something freely given. It felt more like something you earned by being exactly who they expected, and I never quite knew how to become that person. I still remember one afternoon in the garden with my grandmother. I asked her a question that, looking back now, no child should ever have had to ask. I said, "Why do people smile without warmth?" At the time, I did not have the language for what I was feeling. I only knew that something in our house looked loving from a distance and still felt emotionally cold up close. Now I understand it better. I was learning how to recognize emotional distance long before I understood what real safety felt like. That is one of the saddest things about children in families like mine. They become emotionally observant far too young. They notice tone, pauses, withheld affection, and little shifts in expression because that is how they survive. If you grow up in a house where love feels conditional, you begin studying people before you even understand yourself. I met Adrian Cole in the library, which was one of the few places in my life that felt quiet in a good way. It was not quiet like my house, where silence often meant tension. It was a gentler kind of quiet, the kind that lets a person breathe. Adrian was not the kind of person my family would have respected. He did not come from money, did not belong to the right circles, and did not carry himself with the polished confidence people in Willow Creek admired. But he had something much rarer than polish. He had kindness. The first time he asked me, "Are you okay?" I remember not knowing how to answer, because no one had asked me that question in a very long time. With Adrian, I did not feel like a mistake that needed to be corrected or hidden. I felt like a person. That feeling changed something in me. It made me realize how starved I had been for simple human warmth. Then, one day, standing in a gas station restroom with a pregnancy test in my hand, I saw two lines, and in that moment, everything in my life changed. Fear has a very specific feeling when you are young. It is not dramatic the way movies make it look. It is quiet and physical. Your stomach drops, your chest tightens, and your mind starts racing ahead of you before your body can even catch up. When I told Adrian, he did not run. He did not make excuses, and he did not ask me to disappear into the problem alone. He took my hands and said, "We'll figure it out." "You're not alone." Part of me believed him, because I wanted to. But another part of me already knew my family would never see it that way. I knew that when I told them, their first concern would not be whether I was scared, it would be what this meant for them. I told them at dinner, at one of those quiet, perfectly arranged family dinners where the table looked beautiful and nobody said anything real unless it fit the image of the evening. I can still remember the way the silverware looked under the light, the folded napkins, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then I said, "I'm pregnant." The room went still. My father looked at me and asked, "Who is the father?" I told him. I told him Adrian's name, where he worked, where he came from, and with every detail I could see something inside my father hardening. He did not explode. He did not need to. That was not his style. He became quieter, colder, more precise. Then he said, "You will not keep that baby." I remember whispering, "It's my child," because that was all I had the strength to say. He looked at me as if I had damaged something valuable and answered, "If you keep it, you are no longer part of this family." That was the moment I understood that for some families, reputation matters more than love, and when those two things come into conflict, love is the first thing they sacrifice. 2 hours later, I was standing outside in the rain. My mother opened the door, not my father. That detail stayed with me for years, because there was something uniquely painful about it. My father was the colder one. Yes, but my mother was the one who still could have chosen tenderness in that final moment. And she didn't. She pointed outside and told me to leave. I looked up at the second-floor window and saw Daniel and Hannah standing there, watching. No one came downstairs. No one said, "Stop." No one said, "She's still your daughter." No one said anything that could have changed the direction of that night. Then the porch light went off. And in that instant, I understood something I would carry for the rest of my life. I was not simply being sent away. I was being erased. If you have ever waited for someone to choose you and they didn't, then you already understand that silence can be louder than rejection. There is a particular pain in realizing that people had a chance to protect you and chose not to. It changes the way you see them forever. What happened next could have destroyed me, and in some ways it did, but not in the way people expect. I did not collapse dramatically. I adapted, because sometimes survival is not beautiful. Sometimes it is just the stubborn decision to keep moving because there is no safe place to stop. Adrian came for me that night, and he did not arrive with solutions or speeches. He came with presence, and sometimes presence is the purest form of love. We had fear, very little money, and a future that looked uncertain in every direction. For a while, survival looked like small rooms, long hours, cheap food, and exhaustion that never really lifted. But it was also the first time in my life I lived somewhere without pretending. There was no image to maintain, no performance, no carefully edited version of reality. It was hard, but it was honest. And honesty, I would later learn, is one of the most healing things a wounded person can stand inside. When Mila was born, I held her in my arms and made a choice that would shape everything that came after. I chose not to pass the pain forward. That sounds simple when people say it quickly, but it isn't. Pain does not vanish just because you want it to. It waits inside people, and if they do not face it, it becomes the way they love, the way they speak, the way they wound others without even realizing they are repeating what hurt them. But when I looked at my daughter, I knew I could not let that happen. She deserved more than survival. She deserved emotional safety, and even though I did not fully know how to build that yet, I knew I would spend my life trying. Life after that night did not suddenly become meaningful or inspiring. It became practical. It became about getting through each day without falling apart, about making sure there was enough money for rent, enough food in the kitchen, and enough strength left in me to hold my daughter when she cried. People like to say that struggle builds character, but what they don't say is that it also builds exhaustion, and for a long time, that was the only thing I felt. I worked wherever I could, took shifts no one wanted, learned quickly that the world does not slow down just because your life has changed overnight. There were mornings when my body refused to move, nights when I lay awake wondering how long I could keep going like that. But every time I looked at Mila, something in me refused to give up, not because I was strong, but because I had no other choice. Over time, something began to shift inside me. It was not sudden, Not dramatic, but it was real. I stopped waiting for my family to call. I stopped imagining what I would say if they came back. I stopped building conversations in my head that would never happen. That kind of mental space, once it clears, changes everything. It gives you room to see your life as it is, not as you wish it had been. That was when I began to notice something about myself that I had never been allowed to explore before. I had an eye for space, for how a room could feel different with small changes, for how light, color, and arrangement could change the way a person experienced a place. At first, it was just something I did instinctively, helping neighbors, rearranging small apartments, making places feel less heavy. But slowly, it became something more. It became work, then skill, then purpose. That was also when Evelyn Moore entered my life, and sometimes I think back and realize how much one person can change the direction of another's life simply by seeing them clearly. Evelyn did not look at me with pity, and she did not treat me like I was fragile. She saw potential, raw and unpolished, but real. She told me that what I had was not just taste, it was intuition. And intuition, when developed, becomes something powerful. Under her guidance, I began to shape what I was doing into something sustainable. Clients became consistent, projects became larger, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something that belonged to me, not something I was trying to earn approval for. Years passed in a way that feels both long and strangely fast when I look back now. Mila grew up in a home that was not perfect, but it was honest. She laughed easily, asked questions without fear, and never once doubted that she was wanted. That, more than anything else, felt like a quiet victory. Because breaking a cycle is not loud. It is not something people applaud. It is something you feel in the absence of fear, in the way a child relaxes instead of watching every movement in the room. I often wondered if my parents ever thought about me, if they ever questioned what they had done. But over time, those questions stopped mattering. Not because I had answers, but because I no longer needed them to move forward. Then, just when life had finally reached a kind of steady rhythm, everything shifted again. Adrian died. It happened without warning, the way loss often does, leaving no time to prepare, no time to soften the impact. One moment he was there, part of every ordinary detail of my life, and the next, there was a silence that felt impossible to fill. Losing him was not just grief, it was disorientation. He had been the first person
Ladies
who
and
chose
welcome
me
to
without
Warsaw. Please
conditions,
remain seated
and
with your
suddenly,
seatbelt
that
fastened.
presence
If
was
the fasten
gone.
seatbelt
I
sign has
remember
been
sitting
switched
on the
off
floor one
and the
night
captain
after
comes to
Mila had
complete
fallen
stop, please
asleep,
find a parking position.
realizing that
Please
I was
open
now the
overhead
only
compartment
person
carefully and check
responsible
the
for
seat
holding
pockets for any
everything together.
items you may have
And
left.
the weight of that
Musimy
understanding was
najść pole.
almost
Thank you
unbearable.
and goodbye.
But
Szanowni
again,
Państwo,
life
witamy
did
w
not
Warszawie.
pause to give me time
Prosimy o
to
pozostanie na
process it.
swoich miejscach i
Mila
nieodpychanie
still
pasów
needed me.
bezpieczeństwa do momentu
The world
całkowitego
still moved
zatrzymania się
forward.
zawodu wyłączenia
And so I
sygnalizacji.
did what I had learned to
Zapięcia
do.
pasów. Prosimy
I kept
również o
going.
ostrożne
Grief
otwieranie
changes
półek
people,
bagażowych.
but not always in
Życzę
visible
Państwu
ways.
miłego pobytu w Polsce.
It settles
Dziękujemy i do
quietly,
widzenia.
becomes part of how you see things, part of how you move through the world. I became more focused, more intentional, less willing to waste energy on things that did not matter. Work became not just a necessity, but a structure that held me in place when everything else felt uncertain. And slowly, very slowly, I found a new kind of balance. Not happiness in the simple sense, but something steadier. Something that did not depend on everything being okay all the time. And then, after nearly 20 years of silence, my past came back to my door. Victor and Elaine stood there as if no time had passed, as if the distance between us had been nothing more than a temporary misunderstanding. They were older, of course, but not changed in the ways that mattered. They spoke calmly, politely, using the same tone they had always used when they wanted to control a situation without appearing harsh. They talked about reconnecting, about how life is short, about how family should come back together. Not once did they say they were sorry. Not once did they acknowledge what had happened. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. They were not there to repair the past. They were there to manage it. When Victor placed the check on the table, the gesture was so deliberate that it almost felt rehearsed. The amount was significant, more than enough to change many people's lives, and I could see in his expression that he believed it would change mine. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was what came with it. He asked me to attend their golden anniversary, a large event, carefully planned, filled with people who had known them for years. And then he added the condition that made everything clear. He wanted me to bring a son, a grandson, a continuation of the story they had told the world for 2 decades. I looked at him for a long moment. Not because I didn't understand, but because I did. They had built a version of reality that excluded my daughter, that replaced truth with something more acceptable, something easier to present. That is how a family secret survives for so long. It is not just hidden, it is rewritten, reinforced, repeated until even the people who created it begin to believe it. And now they needed me to participate in that version of reality, to confirm it, to help them maintain it in front of everyone who mattered to them. Something inside me shifted in that moment. Not suddenly, not violently, but with a quiet certainty. I realized that I was no longer the girl standing in the rain, waiting to be chosen. I was someone else now. Someone who had built a life without them, who had raised a child without their approval, who had learned how to live without needing their version of acceptance. And because of that, I no longer felt the same fear I would have felt years ago. I did not need to argue with him. I did not need to convince him of anything. I simply needed to decide who I was going to be in that moment. I told him I would come. Not because I agreed, not because I forgave, but because I understood that some truths do not belong in private conversations. Some truths need to be spoken where they were hidden the longest. The night of the anniversary arrived with the kind of quiet tension that only comes when you know something important is about to happen. The ballroom was filled with light, music, and carefully curated details, every element designed to reflect success, stability, and permanence. People moved through the room with practiced ease, greeting one another, sharing stories, reinforcing the image that had been built over years. And on stage, my father stood ready to speak, to present his version of family once again. When Mila and I walked into that room, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not fear, not anger, something clearer, something steadier. It was the feeling of stepping into a space that had once rejected me and realizing it no longer had the power to define me. Mila walked beside me, not behind, not uncertain, but present in a way that made everything real. She was not a secret. She was not something to hide. She was the truth they had tried to erase. Victor saw us. For a brief moment, his composure broke, and I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before. Not regret, not sadness, fear, because people like him do not fear the past. They fear exposure. They fear losing control of the narrative they have spent years maintaining. And in that moment, he understood that control was slipping. I walked to the stage, took the microphone, and spoke calmly, because truth does not need volume to be heard. My name is Emma Carter, I said, and even before I continued, I could feel the room shifting. I am the daughter this family chose to forget. I did not rush. I did not dramatize. I told the story exactly as it happened, because reality, when spoken clearly, carries its own weight. I spoke about that night, about the rain, about the door, about the silence that followed. And then I turned slightly and said, "The child I was carrying is my daughter, Mila." She stepped forward, and in that moment, the version of reality they had built for 20 years began to collapse. "I have never had a son," I said, and that sentence did what no argument ever could. It removed the foundation of the story they had created. It exposed the family secret not as something complicated, but as something simple. A choice. A decision to replace truth with something more convenient. And once that choice was visible, everything else became clear. What happened after that did not feel like an explosion. It felt like a release. Conversations stopped. Faces changed. People looked at one another, recalculating everything they thought they knew. Daniel spoke, admitting what he had seen and ignored. Hannah followed, acknowledging the silence she had chosen. And in that moment, the story was no longer mine alone. It became shared. It became undeniable. I did not stay to argue. I did not stay to watch it fall apart. I placed the microphone down and left with Mila, because the point had never been to destroy them. It had been to end the lie. Truth does not need to linger. Once it is spoken, it does its work whether you remain in the room or not. Weeks later, we sat at my table. Not a perfect table, not a carefully arranged one, but a real one. Mila laughed, spoke freely, and at one point she said something that stayed with me. She said she used to think something was wrong with her because she did not have the kind of family other people had. Then she smiled and said, "Now I understand I wasn't missing anything. I was just waiting for the right people." And in that moment, I understood that everything we had been through had led to something that could not have been built any other way. This story is not about revenge. It is about truth, about the quiet strength it takes to choose honesty when silence would be easier, about understanding that family is not defined by image or expectation, but by presence, by care, by the willingness to stand beside someone when it matters most. And if there is one thing I have learned, it is this: a family secret can shape your life, but it does not have to define it. And the moment you choose truth, you begin to take that power back. After that night, something changed in a way that wasn't immediately visible from the outside, but could be felt in every quiet moment that followed. The Carter name still existed, the house still stood, the world did not collapse in some dramatic, cinematic way, but the illusion that had held everything together for so long no longer had the same power. And once an illusion breaks, it cannot be rebuilt in the same way, no matter how much people try to pretend it is still intact. I did not hear from Victor for a long time after that, and in some ways, that silence felt familiar, almost expected. It was the same silence that had defined so much of my life, the same absence of acknowledgement that had once hurt me deeply. But this time, it did not have the same effect, because I was no longer waiting for it to be filled. That is something people do not always understand about healing. It is not that the past disappears, it is that it loses its authority over your present. Elaine wrote to me, not once, but several times. Her letters were careful, thoughtful, and filled with a kind of emotion that seemed genuine but also incomplete. She spoke about regret, about time lost, about wishing things had been different, but she never quite said the words that mattered most. She never said, "I chose wrong." And for a long time, I tried to understand why that was so difficult for her, until I realized that admitting the truth fully would mean facing a version of herself she had spent years avoiding. And not everyone is ready to do that, even when they know they should. Daniel came to see me. He did not bring explanations or excuses. He brought honesty, late but real. He told me that he had thought about that night more times than he could count, that he had replayed it in his mind, imagining himself walking down those stairs, saying something, doing something different. But the truth is, regret does not change what happened. It only changes what you understand about yourself afterward. And sometimes, that understanding is the beginning of something better, even if it comes too late to fix the past. Hannah took longer. She struggled in a different way, not with denial, but with guilt. There is a particular kind of weight that comes from knowing you saw something wrong and chose not to act. It does not shout. It lingers. It shows up in quiet moments, in small reminders, in the way you see yourself when no one else is looking. When she finally spoke to me, she did not try to explain. She simply said, "I should have done more." And in that moment, I knew she was telling the truth. And sometimes, truth, even when it is painful, is enough to begin again. But the most important thing was not what they did or did not do afterward. The most important thing was what did not change in my life. Mila still laughed the same way. She still filled the house with a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with presence. We still sat at the same table, shared the same small routines, lived a life that was not impressive to outsiders but felt complete in a way I had never experienced growing up. And that is when I understood something that took me years to learn. Stability is not something you inherit. It is something you build, one honest moment at a time. I also began to see my grandmother differently in those final years we had together. For a long time, I had carried a quiet disappointment in her, a feeling that she had seen what was happening and chosen not to stop it. But as I grew older, I began to understand something more complicated. She had been part of a generation that believed keeping the peace was more important than confronting the truth, that silence could protect a family from breaking. What she did not understand then was that silence does not prevent damage, it only delays it, and when it finally comes, it is often deeper than it needed to be. One afternoon, not long before she passed, she said something to me that stayed with me in a way I did not expect. She said, "I thought I was protecting the family by staying quiet, but I see now that I was protecting the lie." There was no defense in her voice, no attempt to justify what had happened, just recognition. And in that moment, I realized that growth does not always come in time to change the past, but it can still change the meaning of it. It can turn regret into awareness, and awareness, even when it arrives late, has value. Life did not become perfect after that. That is not how stories like this end, no matter how much people want them to. There were still difficult days, still moments where old memories surfaced unexpectedly, still questions that did not have simple answers. But there was also something new that had not existed before. There was clarity. There was a sense of ownership over my own story that could not be taken away again. And perhaps most importantly, there was no longer any confusion about what family meant. Family, I learned, is not defined by who raised you or who shares your name. It is defined by who chooses you consistently, who shows up when it matters, who stands beside you when truth becomes uncomfortable instead of turning away from it. That kind of connection cannot be forced, cannot be created through image or expectation. It is built through action, through presence, through honesty over time. And if there is one thing I would want anyone listening to this story to understand, it is this. A family secret does not just hide the truth. It shapes the lives of everyone involved in ways they may not fully see until much later. It teaches people what to ignore, what to accept, what to stay silent about. But it also creates a moment, eventually, where someone has to decide whether they will continue that pattern or break it. For me, that moment came when I stood in that ballroom and chose to speak instead of staying quiet. It was not an easy decision, and it did not solve everything. But it ended something that needed to end. It stopped the lie from continuing into another generation. And that, in itself, was enough. Because in the end, the goal is not to rewrite the past or to punish the people who created it. The goal is to make sure it does not define the future. It is to take what was hidden and bring it into the light, not to destroy, but to understand, to heal, and to move forward without carrying something that was never yours to carry in the first place. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. You are not responsible for the silence that shaped your past, but you are responsible for the truth you choose going forward. You do not need permission to live honestly. You do not need approval to build a life that feels real to you. And you do not have to continue a story that was written without your voice. Because the moment you choose truth, even when it is difficult, even when it changes everything, you begin to create something new. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And in the long run, that is the only thing that lasts.